Welcome back to Thinking Matters. We're doing this at a new location which is undisclosed today. I trust that you enjoyed Drive-In Church this week. There'll be some new formats coming in the weeks to come, and I again trust that you will enjoy those and will profit from them as a body. Today we have to talk about what's been in the news a lot lately, which is the concept of justice. Justice is something that we all crave, and the reason we crave that is that we're made in the image of God, and God is a just God. It's one of his fundamental characters is justice, and justice will always be served ultimately in the end. In the meantime, we live in a world where God wants us to exhibit his features and his character, and one of those is justice. And there are three proverbs which I'd like to share with you this morning in the context of what's been going on. The first one comes from Proverbs 21:15, when it says, "When justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to the evildoers." Again, the concept of justice always has to do with the notion of right and wrong. There are some things which are right and some things which are wrong, and justice is the administration of that and the correction of that. And so keeping that in mind, the second proverb is, "Whoever sows injustice reaps calamity, and the rod they wield in fury will be broken." Injustice is not going to be tolerated in the end by God, nor is it well tolerated by people on this side of glory. And that's why we sometimes see people become very frustrated and angered over the notion of injustice. The last one is, "By justice, a king gives a country stability, but one who is greedy for bribes tears it down." And so we have to be sure that the government, which God again has ordained, that it's just, that we do things with that impartiality required for justice. The reason that we use government to bring about justice is we're not vigilantes. We don't take justice into our own hands. We see that even in the scriptures, where when someone has sinned against you and you go to them and you can't bring correction, then you bring outside people. You bring people outside the tinderbox of the emotions of the conflict to adjudicate justice. And justice gets adjudicated by that third person, which is why ultimately God is the most just king. He knows all things. He knows the circumstances. There's no fact which is unknown or unturned when God administers his justice. And it's done and adjudicated by that third party who is God, who brings justice. We've been charged with doing that here and now in the world. And we as humans don't always do it well. We sometimes have inherent issues that we have a hard time seeing. Even the two people in conflict, but even maybe a larger group, your group. If let's just say you're of a certain group of people, and then the people who are judging come from that group of people, that could lead to injustice. And so we have to be very careful that our government, that our culture, our society operates in justice. And when it doesn't, it leaves people angry. Anger and frustration are a time when we often will fall into sin. We want to bring about what is just in our own means, in our own hands, and that sometimes can be sinful. The scriptures warn us to not sin in our anger. To be angry over injustice, there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to be very careful of what we do with that emotional energy called anger, how we bring that forward, and do we bring that forward in a God-honoring fashion or in a destructive fashion. And so again, these are cultural issues which we have to struggle with. Remember, people are social. We form cultures. Cultures are just people's ideas which come together and then become a dominant idea, and we would look at that from a distance and say that's their culture. We're going to see that today as we move forward from this issue into our lesson in Titus. And so let's do that now. So we're in Titus chapter 1, and Paul has left behind Titus, and he's asked him to go and to establish leadership in the churches. These are plural churches, so there's multiple of them. This is God's plan, is that we would, as people, social people, gather around the cause of the gospel, and that there needs to be a form of leadership. There needs to be some structure. We can't just have everyone doing whatever they choose or please, but we need to organize ourselves. God is a God of order. He He has ordained several such structures. He ordained marriage, that it's not a free-for-all between a man and a woman. He's ordained families. He's ordained churches. He's also ordained governments. And so all these things come together as we organize ourselves around these things. And Paul's charging Titus to pick leaders who exhibit and can teach the ideas essential to the church, I'll just say culture, to the church group of beliefs and values which they hold. And so those people need to be very poised people who know what the truth is, and then demonstrate that in their life, in their family, in their work, in their status in the community, because that's how the church culture becomes a strong culture, by doing the things that God would want it to do in a fashion that God would want it done in. And so he's charged Titus to do that in Crete. And then he comments on culture itself. This is Paul commenting, and he says, "For there are many rebellious people, mere talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision group. They must be silenced, because they are ruining whole households by teaching things they ought not to teach, and for the sake of dishonest gain. Even one of their own prophets said, 'Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons.'" Now, that was not Paul's quoting someone else there. Paul didn't make that statement, but he's saying, listen, they even say this about their own culture, because it wasn't unique to the Cretans' genetics, it was unique to their culture, that their culture tolerated and allowed things like lying, being evil brutes, and lazy gluttons. There were things in the culture which were harmful. Remember, culture is one of our three enemies. We have our flesh, we have the devil, and then we have the world. And the world essentially is another way of stating the culture, the group of ideas which comes up from people. As we live together, we create ideas, and these ideas are not always biblical. They're not always the tact and the route that God would want us to take. And so Paul is cautioning Titus, one, you need to formulate leaders for your church to move it forward, people who understand the truth, who can teach the truth, who live out the truth. And then you need to beware of the ideas and the things which are in the culture around the church. Wherever the church is planted, there's going to be another, I'll just say, dominant culture that's going to have ideas which can be very ungodly, unbiblical. And we need to be keen. We need to understand the culture. We understand how they think, because remember, we become a part of that culture at some level, because we live in it, we work in it, we hear their ideas rub on us, the way that they deal with people and things. And you can see this, some cultures use lying and cheating. For you to be cheated is just part of the culture. You almost expect people to cheat you in the grocery store in some countries in Africa. And those ideas hold a culture back because they're not godly ideas. Remember, we have to live and think the gospel. It's not just something that gets us into heaven, it's how we conduct ourselves. We can't be overcome by evil, even as we talk about the current situation in our culture with the injustices, that we can't overcome evil by evil, we overcome evil by good. And so that's a tendency which we forget. In the heat of the moment, we might fall to the cultural norms of behavior rather than the biblical norms of behavior, which again, in James, we studied a few weeks ago, there are two sources of wisdom. One would be this world, the culture, and that generally leads to dissension because it's generally based on the default setting of human beings, which is selfishness. And then there's God's wisdom, which is based upon love, which is the opposite of selfishness. It's doing what's best for another person, no matter what it costs me. That undoes selfishness. Self is not the regard, it's not the reason for doing it, it's the other person that I need to be good to and do right to. And so as you go through your week this week, understand that justice is important. It's part of God's character. Justice will always be served, but in the meantime, we are charged to serve it and to act justly, to walk humbly. First step would be to walk humbly, to love mercy, and then to do justice. Those are the things that God would want us to do as a culture to each other, to honor Him. Have a good day.